So our next speaker is John Gillis. He's Professor Emeritus of History of Rutgers University, and he's going to talk to us about that they're not continents in miniature, islands as ecotones.
Well, thanks to everyone who's involved here. I've been looking forward to this visit for some time. As a retired professor, you actually get a yearning for the classroom, which is unusual among the teaching staff. But this is a wonderful opportunity to say a few words. Excuse me. Got a bit of asthma as well. Okay. Well, had everyone read my paper, I wouldn't be reading it, but I'll try to be brief in the reading of this paper, and I'll also have some side comments to make. By the way, I'm just back from Jersey, where I was speaking on the anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. And the title of my talk at Rutgers, Newark was Hurricane Sandy, the story of an unnatural disaster. And I think you'll see in this paper that I'm very concerned with the way we label events and the way we, in fact, interpret events. So, islands are different from all other lands insofar as they are defined by water. It's so simple, but so obvious and so neglected. It has been noted that the concept of island implies a particular and intense relationship between land and water. No wonder, because the word in English comes from an older word, I, meaning water, and land put together. Now, the question here is, and I'll emphasize this today, that no island is an ecosystem. It is always more than one ecosystem. In other words, it's an ecotone. How many people in this room have heard the word ecotone or read it? Okay, a few, but not many. But I hope by the end of this talk, you'll be a convert to the concept of ecotone. Ecotones are places where two ecosystems interact, sometimes more, overlap, and as the word implies, there exists at the interface between ecosystems a creative tension that we want to develop and exploit. Islands are never clearly bounded entities that we imagine them to be. That's been already stated. And as Rachel Carson rightly insisted, the edge of the sea remains always an elusive and indefinable boundary. We will never understand island environments, or indeed any other kind of environment, until we stop treating them as exclusively territorial, as continents in miniature. My interest in the ecotonal nature of island arises from my work on shores. When I was doing the book Islands of the Mind, I wasn't particularly aware of environmental history, and I certainly didn't know the term ecotone. But it has grown very important in my work when I got around to writing about shores, which are the ultimate, obvious example of an ecotone. The shore is the archetypal ecotone, where marine and terrestrial ecosystems intersect. Now, the interest in ecotones is relatively recent and still underdeveloped, so there's plenty of work to be done out there. But it represents a growing concern, thank goodness, with all things marginal, not only in the sciences, but the humanities. The marginal is no longer marginal. Think about that for a while. As Tim Morton suggests, the margin should not be simply the in-between, but a distinctive world with its own dynamics. And margins harbor diversity and have been integral to evolution. They are the classic biodiverse environment. And as the environmentalist Wendell Berry insists, If change is to come, then it will have to come from the margin, not to the center. So what I'm trying to do in my work on shores is to center the margin, turn things inside out. And it is this quality, I think, of the margin that contributes to the resiliency and generativity of islands that we're going to be talking about today. Now, our understandings about the relationship between land and water have unfortunately not been very closely examined by historians or by scientists. Our understanding, as limited as it is largely a Western and modern understanding and does not reflect the various and multiple concepts of water-land relationship that have existed through time and indeed through space. The ancients assumed that the world was terra aqueous, that it was land and water together in strange mixes. And this terra aqueous view still exists in many parts of the world. We'll hear later on one case, I believe, of Hawaii. Until the 18th century, in fact, shores were considered waterlands, an indefinite zone of ever-changing dimension. It was not until the term coast was invented in the late, and applied, I should say, in the late 18th century, when the coast ceased to be a verb, to coast down the shore, and became a noun applied initially to certain edges of continents and ultimately to many different shores, that this changed. The coastline was a cartographer's fiction to begin with, superimposed on the fractile shore by authorities of the newly emerging nation state. It was a political boundary as much as anything else, and later turned into so-called fact of nature. Come back to that in a moment. States look to coasts to confirm their claim on sovereignty, and ultimately the coast becomes a part of a natural unit of what was considered, and still is considered in too many places, advanced civilization. So Jonathan Rabin, my favorite seaborne novelist, says, people who live on continents get into the habit of regarding the ocean as journey's end, full stop at the end of the trek. But islands, he notes, offer another perspective which we need to take into account, one that takes water itself into account. As Rabin says, people who live on islands, especially small islands, for them the sea is just the beginning. Islanders know the sea goes on and on, a continuous loop of shoreline and life without a terminus. So we got to think, when we think about islands, of the waters, connecting them, around them, the alongshore as well as the offshore. Unfortunately, it is the continentalist view of history, Godfrey mentioned this a little while ago, that has infused both history and geography in modern times. First in the West, and then, of course, around the world. When European and American imperialists entered the Pacific in the 18th century, they set the boundaries around islands, and these made no sense to indigenous people who did not understand the difference between water and land in the way that these interlopers did. In the modern era, then, islands have been too often treated as miniature continents or measured in terms of continents, emphasizing, and I quote, the bounded landscape at the expense of the broader seascape. Environmentalists have followed in this tradition, focusing either on land or on sea, but ignoring what connects them and binds them together as hybrids. For the most part, environmental sciences have also been landlocked disciplines. This is really astonishing. When I began to investigate environmentalism, you go to an environmental encyclopedia, and there's one article on water, maybe on the sea, maybe on a river or whatever. Environmentalists have been as blind to the 7/10 of the globe covered by water as they have been to many things, but particularly to this. The oceans constitute something like 98% of the biomass or biosystems of our so-called Earth, which ought to actually be called planet ocean rather than planet Earth. And Western civilization has largely ignored the sea except to pass over it. The cartographic tradition of drawing lines where none exist, so-called coastlines, and then coloring blue all that lies offshore has reinforced this notion of the elemental difference between land and water. I'll come back to that in a moment. So lands are deemed to have histories. They have a right to histories. But the sea was assumed to exist outside of time. Even Carson talked about the incorruptible sea as if there is no history to the ocean. Modern historical writing has been largely continentalist in orientation, as many of you know. And for most historians, history begins and ends on the beach. Even maritime history has been largely concerned of what happens on rather than actually in the sea. Islands, which can be shown to have played an enormous role in historical development, have suffered from a similar continentalist condescension. And only recently have they reclaimed their proper place in time, largely through the efforts of global historians, but also from Baldacchino and other pioneers in this field. Now it falls to environmental historians to reveal their relationship to a larger environment. And that's what I'm going to do very briefly in the little time that I have left. So, reformulating and revitalizing environmental history requires that we not only go offshore, but we follow water where it takes us. More attention must be given to watersheds, estuaries, to brown rather than blue water. We've got to get off the blue water kick and get into the brown water one. We must follow migratory species, including humans, back and forth across tide lines. This is very important. For island environmental history must be a history without borders, a history in depth but also in breadth, where earth and wind and water are in constant motion and interaction. We must learn the true meaning of fluidity in our writing as well as in our explorations. Of necessity, such history will be more liquid, but still grounded in the actual experience of islands and islanders and shore dwellers. We need to muddy the waters, frankly, by bringing earth, water, and humanity together rather than avoiding those places like swamps, estuaries, the edges of things, the margins of things, which we have avoided physically and mentally for too long. It's particularly important to understand that island history is a co-construction of humans and nature. And here I think we have something to really to discuss. Nature has shaped islands. They're often seen practically as nature in this nature tourism. But islands also bear the imprint of humankind, perhaps more than any other topography on Earth they do. It has been said that it is just as interesting to ask how people make islands as islands make people. And indeed, islands appeal to us because they appear to be bounded objects which can easily be grasped in the mind's eye. But this is an illusion, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the paper. The illusion of isolation, the illusion of the mind's eye. So environments, I would argue, and here I have an argument with that I think is viable in the climate debate today. Environments are not something apart from us, but something we have had a hand in constructing. The scale, this is scale and scope for Godfrey, the scale of an island environment is partly determined by nature. Of course, I'm not going to be as foolish as to deny that. The patterns of wind and waves impinge upon it, but it is also defined by how far its inhabitants, islanders, range offshore and alongshore in their search for resources and connection and trade and all the rest. So I could go into great detail here, which I won't, about how the scope of islanders expands and contracts according to the species that they are searching for in terms of fishing, or the trade that they are seeking in terms of commerce and so on. This should be fairly obvious, but it's not. It's amazing how many studies of islands remain focused on islands, when in fact islanders are well known, and Godfrey has stated this many times over, the most wide-ranging and free-ranging peoples in the world. The last thing you'll find in an islander is a stay-at-home isolate. They are really remarkable in how far they travel. Anthropologists found out that, to their shame, in the 19th century when they discovered that many of their respondents were more widely traveled than they were, you know. Okay, people know this. So the whalers of Nantucket ranged from the Atlantic, then into the Pacific, encountering a remarkable variety of conditions, living an ecotonal existence, because that's what they're doing. They're crossing boundaries constantly. Islanders are extraordinarily sensitive and adapted to the conditions of both land and water, which gives them their specialness, in my view. Their relationship to nature is by no means passive. On the contrary, they've been shaping their own environments for millennia. And I learn this every summer, to my shame, on Great God Island off the coast of Maine, where my local neighbors are so much more handy and capable and seaworthy than I am. And I envy them, and I'm also sometimes a little afraid for them. But islands are, as Godfrey already said and Pam reinforced, are notorious shape changers. They always have been, because shores are fractal rather than linear. It's unclear how many miles there are around any given island. Their exact dimensions are awfully hard to pin down. They change with every tide, with major storms, and of course with earthquakes. And our ancestors, when they tried to understand islands, were right in thinking of them as moving, floating, alive. And we'll come back to this theme later on. The aliveness of islands and of shores is something that we need to recapture for our own sake, for our own ability to master these environments. Like shores, they are elusive and indefinable. The first thing you must learn about a shore is it is moving, it is alive, it is not fixed, and any attempt to fix it will lead to disaster. In places of great seismic activity, they are known to rise up suddenly and disappear just as quickly. And in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, there are any number of vanished islands, some quite real, some quite fanciful, but let's not draw these lines between the imaginary and the real when they really don't make much sense in coping with the realities of island environments or shore environments. Now, in my book called The Human Shore, Seacoasts in History, published about a year ago, published almost at the moment that Sandy hit New Jersey. Fortunately, I was in California by that time. I have attempted to narrate a story of human evolution focused entirely on the shore. Now let me explain what I mean by this. Beginning with the great geographer Carl Sauer in the 50s and 60s, there came a recognition among at least some anthropologists and some geographers that the shore was the original home of mankind. We can trace it back now, Homo sapiens, back to the shores of South Africa about 200,000 years ago. And what I've done in my book is take that starting point and trace the role of shore dwellers to the colonization of the earth by alongshore journeys out of Africa into Australia and ultimately into the New World. As Rowan Jacobson has reminded us in his fine study of oyster culture in the American Northwest, we are made for and made by that thin world where land meets sea. And the Haida people who knew how to cultivate their shores, cultivate them for oysters and clams and so on, understood what they understood as their shore, which they gave a specific name to, was neither land nor sea, but both. Living in a different kind of space, in a different kind of time, much more attuned to the daily, monthly, and seasonal rhythms of the sea. So what you find at the shore is a different world. And I'm not being romantic here. If we can go back, as I would like more historians to do, and reclaim the history of the shore, we will find a different story for our human narrative, and that's what I'm attempting to do. These people not only lived at the edge of the sea, but more importantly, they lived with the sea in a manner that is almost entirely lost today, except for some islanders, and normally not in the Western world. What happened over the course of 3 or 4 centuries was the hardening of the edge, the elimination of that ecotone, that soft margin which was the original home of mankind and the support for so many civilizations for so many thousands of years. The hardening of the shore, the hardening of the edge of the island, it seems to me is a crucial dimension to our own troubled modernity. It has not only hardened the shore physically with sea walls. The Japanese have concreted 65% of their shores now. See what that got them in 2011. The hardening of shores, but there's also been the hardening of attitudes toward the land and the sea. Islanders, particularly in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, have become much more continental, landlubberly in their habits and perspectives, viewing their shores, unfortunately, like coasts, as firm boundaries rather than permeable medians. Their experience of water is now episodic. When hurricanes, tsunamis, and oil spills strike, they are reminded that they live in an ecotone, but then quickly forget in the wake of disaster. In Japan, for example, which has lived with the sea for thousands of years, tsunami stones once marked the highest inundations of the land, but these are now forgotten as warning signals. So, here I shall conclude. In modern culture, for complicated reasons that I can't spell out today, a growing part of humanity, it's estimated something like 50% of the American population now live close to the sea. A growing part of humanity now crowds close to the shore. But only a tiny minority of those who occupy the shores have any idea how to live with them or with the sea itself. In the past, shores were colonized from the sea, remember? Remember those pilgrims? Jamestown, Plymouth. But now the shores are being colonized from the interior. And in the absence of any sense of their past, the people who now occupy the shore have very little sense of the ecotone or the environment in which they have planted themselves. Now, I talked at Newark 2 days ago about the necessity of strategic retreat rather than some physical fix like seawalls or barriers to the problem of the shore. But obviously, there are problems with any kind of tinkering with the shore where you have so many vested interests, not only the homeowners, but of the tax bases of local communities and all the rest. So, for 200 years now, national histories began and ended at coastlines. Now, however, as nations begin to extend their territory seaward in search of underwater, undersea resources, that frame no longer holds. What we're seeing now is a questioning of the whole concept of the continent and the concept of the island in turn. What were once natural boundaries are now called into question. There are something like 160 unchallenged marine borders, but there are 270 that are contested in some way or another. This is interesting, and I've got to follow up on this. Maps are increasingly concerned with what lies offshore, and the world is beginning to look much more archipelagic, returning to an original cartography of the ancients and the medieval world. Global history has caused us to be wary of reifying political boundaries. You know, there's all this talk of boundaryless global world and so on. But we've got to be also prepared to treat so-called natural boundaries as equally fantastic, equally liquid. As we've already seen, land and water constitute an ecological continuum. We need to be wary of distinguishing too sharply between the marine and the terrestrial. So-called blue water history and its blue water navies has vastly exaggerated the importance of the deep sea at the expense of the near shore or the along shore worlds, where, by the way, all of human history, most fishing and most shipping and most activity has been concentrated, not on the deep sea, but the near shore. Perhaps it's time then to focus on what might be called brown water history in order to better understand those places where sea and land are inseparable, particularly in estuaries and places like that. Get back to islands, don't want to leave them behind for the shores because they are, above all, shores. And I think the most important part of islands, frankly, is shores. The interfaces where the island as territory intersects with the island as sea. The future of islands depends now on how well islanders, as well as mainlanders, understand these environments and adapt a less insular, less territorial, I think this is something that came out in Godfrey's paper as well, less territorial notion of themselves. Seeing them, I loved his phrase, we are not poor, or they are not poor. Because the people I know on my island may not belong to the upper middle class. They may not even belong to the middle class, but they are not poor. They have resources, mental and physical, which make me feel impoverished. And that's a lesson that we can always learn when we actually interrogate real people in real time. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, our discussant for John's paper and presentation is David Hancock. He's a professor of history here at the University of Michigan. Thank you, David.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out on such a dreary day. And thank you, the Institute, for hosting this conference and inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Most importantly, thank you to John for drafting such a stimulating paper. I did read it. He'll be happy to know. And I've also been a big fan since it came out of the human source, so it's a real pleasure to sort of see him here. Now, I should say, by way of either preface or defense, that I'm not a history of ecotones. I'm not a history of environment. I'm not really even a history of islands, so I'm not sure what I'm doing here. My own research and writing lies in the field of 17th, 18th century American, Atlantic, and British imperial economic and maritime history. But I think the reason I'm here is I did study and write an overly long book on the global reach of one particular island, Madeira, and its principal product, which was wine, between the years 1640 and 1815. Now, its place and its people, to confirm what John just said, were anything but isolated. In fact, that was sort of one of the big themes of the book. And in the book that resulted, I used the history of the island, not really to talk about the island itself, but I used the history of the island's wine as a measure of Atlantic market integration in the early modern period. Now, that says something about me, which says I'm fairly particular and fact-oriented, so you may want to just discount everything I say. But given my sort of penchant for self-doubt as a historian, I ended up learning and writing a lot about this island, much more than any sane person would want to do. And it was with real pleasure that I was able to sort of read this very panoptic assessment of island history. In a way, it's a kind of survey, amusing on what's been written about island history in the last 20, 30, 40 years. Now, John's point, if I had to reduce the paper to 1 or 2 points, is that we should all be ecotonalists now, although I'm sure you didn't come here thinking that. If not that, maybe we should at least be attentive to the ecotonal possibilities of any subjects that arise near the edge where the water meets the land or the land meets the water. What he really is saying is we should closely scrutinize where biological communities of intersecting organisms and their physical environment overlapped, coexist, or intersect, and then we should carefully anatomize the operation of the ecosystems in all 3 states. I think one of the things, he doesn't state it this baldly, but you really have to examine all 3 states at once rather than just looking at just one. In developing the idea, he places real importance on the intersective community. He argues that islands have been treated as continents in miniature, and islands' histories have been written as histories of land masses, with fairly woeful ignorance of the land masses' connection to the sea or of the sea itself. And in this, he's absolutely correct. Subsidiary arguments that he makes along the way, arguments that islands are always changing, not only in their natural state, but in their man-made ideas, institutions, orientations, and that they fall along a spectrum of island experience, are also on the mark from the standpoint of history. Now, these are really the main points, but they were also only the only points I gleaned from this 14-page paper. And when I finished it, I guess I want to say I wanted more. On one level, this sounds a little sort of gripey. On one level, I was thinking that I agreed with it completely, and that's the worst thing to have happen if you're a discussant. It'd be much better if I had read and disagreed with every sentence. But I thought I just read this and read it again and read the 3rd time. I thought, yeah, that's true. That's true. But on another level, I was nagged by this sort of age-old question of so what. I was haunted by that question because John didn't much articulate much of a forward-looking agenda for us. And I guess the question is, if not he, who else can do it? The only thing he really did was say we should look at intersections. But the question is, what intersections? And then what might flow from studying those intersections? It's a bit like sort of saying, as people do plenty of, we should look at power relations. Well, yeah, that's great, but what does that mean? And it's sort of the same thing here. He says we're supposed to go offshore, that's his phrase, and we're supposed to, quote unquote, follow water wherever it takes us. But what does that actually mean? And here maybe I'm a kind of particularist positivist historian, but I guess I want to know not just where we've been as historians, but where as historians we might go. I want a sort of a little clear roadmap from him. Now, as a way of getting at these matters, I'd like to raise several questions. First of all, and I think it needs to be asked, aren't we doing this now? Aren't a few older historians and many more younger historians, and I think it's safe to say in any field, and environmental history is one of these, the great wave of work is really being done by graduate students and assistant professors, and not fully tenured professors at major research universities. So aren't many historians already looking at, to sort of quote him, nature, the patterns of winds and waves that impinge on it, and how far its inhabitants range off and onshore in search of resources? Having just read Jeff Bolster's fine new book, The Mortal Sea, which is a very good study of cod stock depletion in the North Atlantic, I think we are. And you might say, well, he's an exception, but there are dozens of people sort of at a lower level beginning to do the same thing. Bolster and others are beginning to pay careful attention to the environment, the sea itself, the islands and continents that border it, the men and sometimes women who sailed it, the slimy creatures beneath it, and man's use and animals' misuse and use of them. Each new book that appears, it seems, heralds a kind of richer and richer thassalography. In history, there seems to be afoot a larger movement that sweeps present-day writing about the sea towards intersections, exchanges, networks, materiality, and microhistory, and usually displaying through case study possible improvements or areas of future study. Now, one of the great things about Bolster and a few others is that they take seriously the whole biomass: water, currents, weather, winds, marine life, and the men appropriate. In a sense, they do exactly what he's asking us to do, which is think and write ecotonally. The sea itself in these works is an engine of innovation as much as the people who skirt over the sea. It's a huge shift. Now, the question is, isn't that enough? And if not, then what is? Now, I suspect John is going to say, John being John, is that that's not enough, and we're not actually sort of doing this. It's only a handful of people. So the question then becomes, if it's not enough, what more should we as historians be doing precisely? There are the more pressing questions for us, I think, as historians to ponder if we think about the future of islands, or more properly the future of the history, or the future of the writing of the history of islands, and its place in a kind of larger macro history. So basically what the rest of my brief discussion is going to be is a kind of plea for greater specificity, and I'll give a couple examples. Now, as I said, one of my fields is American history, and something similar happened in one of its subfields that has really galvanized the attention of early American historians in the past several decades, and that's the subfield of borderlands. The question was basically sort of, what do we do with this thing that we can't call the frontier anymore, because that's sort of not correct. What do we do with this interior space? And in answering it, it started, I think, right before I got to graduate school and has been sort of flowering ever since. They looked closely at these borderlands, at the people on both sides of the border. They looked at the kind of messy imposition, overlap, intersection, and borrowing that was experienced by the people in the Northwest, the West, and the Southwest of the 13 colonies. And the question now, because it's 20, 30 years later, you begin to get these review essays and these very senior people sort of wondering what they've spent their entire careers on. And they sort of ask what they've gained from this kind of soul searching, and what they've gained from this kind of questioning. And I think the verdict is unclear. So to sort of flip over to sort of islands and ecotones, I'd ask the same question about this. To what end will we actually get if we sort of work this way to write and think ecotonally? What do we think that we'll know that we didn't already know? We may have a different language for it, and that's always useful, I suppose, but will it actually sort of expand sort of the boundaries of our knowledge? And maybe another way of asking this is as a way of getting back to the power of, getting back to the explanatory of ecotonality, I'd like to press John to state clearly and precisely what it might mean prescriptively, and then to better articulate more precisely its kind of operational and theoretical implications. Right now, the command to sort of think and write ecotonally seems rather flat and unelaborated. I'm left sort of not knowing what to do with the approach other than what seems common sense to anyone who, as I did, sort of worked for 7 and 8 years on a port city on an island and its relation to the sea. Now, I can think of 3 ways that may not be much studied by environmental historians, and they might just be 3 possibilities, they might be not, but John, I'm sure, can sort of fill this out in a much richer way. I think we might spend more time studying living organisms, the humans, the animals, the plants, the microbes. And microbes, I think, are important part of this story, which John didn't really highlight much, but how these living organisms exist in conjunction with the non-living components of the environment, things like air, like water, like mineral soil. I think, we haven't focused on certain things that John has mentioned, but we also don't think much about the non-living aspects of the world that we live in. And how do they interact as a system, the living and the non-living? We might spend more time exploring what are the nutrient systems and energy flows for each one of the kind of ecosystems, both the individual ecosystems, the landside ecosystem, the waterside ecosystem, this kind of brown shoreline ecosystem, but not just the individual ecosystem, nutrient systems and energy flows, but also the joint one, which necessarily results from the interaction. Second question or set of questions is, who actually controls these ecosystems? And in this context of control, we could ask, what's the role of external factors versus internal factors? The relevant external factors, environmental historians have dealt with to a certain extent. We've come to expect in environmental history people talk about things like climate, soil, topography. But there are other external factors that are relevant, things like time, or things like potential biota, not necessarily the actual biota, but what's the potential membership of the biota. As to internal factors that affect control, you could ask about things like decomposition, succession, or the types of species that are present. All of these, or if you wanted to go farther afield, you could actually talk about disturbance, you could talk about succession, and related to the species, whether it's a human species, an animal species, plant species, whatever. All of those, as I read what I think is probably the best example of this new environmental history, the Bolster book, those things still don't seem to be much factored into the new environmental history. Or thirdly, we might spend a little more time imparting great agency to the subjects, the human and the non-human alike. Now, I dread saying this because agency is a concept that is currently greatly in fashion. Every one of my graduate students, the first thing they want to do is bring agencies to something. But, relatively few historians actually operationalize agency. Most historians talk about people having it. They get very excited about their subjects having it, but they don't actually know how to show people or animals or plants or rocks exercising it in anything but a kind of vague, anonymous way. And I think they should. And this is, I think, since we're actually sort of dealing with a whole host of sort of actors here, this might be a good possible area to work in. Historical characters like the ones I found in Madeira, whether they're humble fishermen and peasant grape growers, whether they're conservation-minded merchants and landlords and scientists, whether they're government officials, or whether they're the creatures of the deep soil or of the deep sea, should be at the forefront of the story. All of these agents have not only the notional capacity for exerting, but they actually do exert and affect specific outcomes in the historical record. Now, enlivening here, I think if you're painting a picture of an extraordinarily changeable ecosystem, might be the examination of not just non-human agents. Bolster's book spends a lot of time doing this. A lot of these environmental books of the sea take the age-old story of the cod and the whale, but you could take a lot of other fishes, mammals, seabirds, invertebrates. Bolster does this fairly well. But you could also do things with plant life, and as I said, with I don't want to say mineral life, but the mineral state. Animals and plants is usually animal and plant history is usually totally absent, left out of our understanding of the past, and it shouldn't be. Okay, so enough about animals. I've trespassed on time, and there were a lot of questions at the last one, so I sort of want to leave time for questions. Let me just sort of say in conclusion, so it sounds like I'm not a completely not nice person. I do agree with John in almost everything he said, but I'd like him to say more. I do agree with John that we, quote, need to be wary of distinguishing too sharply the marine and the terrestrial. If you deal with anyone in a port city, anyone on a coastline, or anyone on an island, they certainly didn't, and we shouldn't project back on the peoples of the past our own predispositions. An island was both of those things, and it's also a little bit more. So perhaps John can tell us that little bit more, and can tell us that little bit more precisely. Thank you.
John, do you want to respond?
Yeah. Well, David, you'll have to invite me back. Your agenda is a very full one, and I appreciate it. Yeah, sorry. Boy, I think what I should do, I've noted down all your agenda, your list of your do list, and I'll have to think more about it. But you're absolutely right about so many things, and the limits of the way that even environmental history is done, leaving out, for example, seaweed, which would be a wonderful subject, which is so important to the diet, and is now returning to be a part of the diet as we run out of alternatives. Big history has a role in this. You're absolutely right about agency. You and I don't know quite how old you are, but started probably in the great moment of the discovery of history from the bottom up. And we were assigning agency to everything. And perhaps I need to get back to that a little bit, because entering into the environmental field, into the natural sciences domain, is daunting, and you tend then to reach for the more bland generalizations rather than the particulars. But I want to open it up, if you don't mind, for the rest of the audience. So, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
John, I want to thank you for your paper, and I actually wanted to build on some of the comments that David made, because I found myself having the same kind of response to your work. I'm Liz de Legree, and one of the things that I found as I was reading your work, I was thinking, I completely agree with this argument. I've made the same arguments myself, but at the same time I had this moment of feeling like, what is it about this kind of repetition that we keep saying, well, we need to actually keep thinking about the sea. So one of the things that I was thinking about is in the work that I was doing in my earlier book was building on the work of Jeffrey Bolster and the work of Marcus Rediker and Peter Linebaugh and all the kind of new work that's thinking through how we can kind of destabilize the nation and turn to the oceanic as a framework, right? So kind of thinking about the migration of peoples. And that certainly has come from an era in which we're trying to kind of rethink the national frameworks of studying literature or studying history or any of that. And it's made such an impact in my field, which is literature, that we now, our last hire was in transatlantic studies rather than British or American. So one of the things I was raising is that to me, it's a bigger question than saying we need to turn to the sea because our frameworks are limited, but it's raising a kind of meta question as to why are we turning to that question now? Like, why do we keep raising this question that we have to turn to the sea at the moment when many of us are not out there doing the fishing or the sailing or providing our own food? So what is it about the kind of logic that then creates this kind of urban revitalism of a kind of oceanic imaginary?
Well, first of all, I'm not advocating turning to the sea. I don't want us to go offshore again, which was, in many of its original incarnations, very fruitful to the imaginary, but remained exactly on that level. In other words, the greatest works about the sea until the invention of oceanography in the last 50 years were Melville and people like that. They gave us a rich imaginary about the sea. No, my focus is really on the shore. I mean, if there's one contribution to be made here, it is to recognize the shore as its own distinctive area of time and space, of potential research, and to say to people, look, when it's all said and done, this is the place where most action actually occurs. And you can float a number of ships, but in the end, they all come back to these shores, metaphorically, in other words. And I was astonished that when I started this study seriously, maybe 15 years ago, there were only two books that really struck me as original. One was Alain Corbin's The Lure of the Sea, which is a treatment of European shores in the 18th and early 19th century, then he ends. The other one, more controversial, is John Stilgoe's Alongshore, a book which is full of insight by a shoreman himself, now, shall we say, grounded out on the steps of Harvard, no longer connected to the sea, but originating as a son of a boat builder in Cape Cod. So all I'm saying, I'm trying to get across here is, let's not, when one approaches this subject, let us take a deeper look at this one thin space, not very large, but sometimes very large, which is an ecotone. That's all I'm saying. So I agree with you. Look, there are a lot of people exploring the oceans, metaphorically, through art, through literature. I've written a piece called The Blue Humanities in Humanities Magazine, which I think credits the progress that's being made there. But my particular shtick is the shore, I hope the next time you go to the shore, you will not look out to the horizon, but you'll look down at your feet, and you will see the most alive environment you have ever seen. And it will include, David, minerals. Those sands are moving all the time. They are alive, and they will swallow you alive if you're not unaware of it. So it's that kind of thing. Yeah, there's so much to be done. Yes, please. Others? Pam? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you to John and David, and I'll try to make them brief comments. So the first, following off what Liz asked, it seems this question, so, what does the sea, what do islands do for us? We need to separate out, so for historians, what does this turn to the sea do? For some people, right, it's a way to write a transnational history, right? There's these kind of issues of scale and theoretical frameworks. But then with what David asked in terms of pushing you maybe towards even something prescriptive, it's also a question of what disciplines and then individual scholars within disciplines think of the role of their scholarship. And in the Human Shore, you actually, you have prescriptive recommendations about how we need to live with and along the shore that go beyond sort of scholarly concerns. And so, I think, people fall differently on this. But within history, I think if you look at someone like Chakrabarty's, theses on the climate of history, is that it? 4 theses on the climate of history. Thank you. Right. I mean, that's a calling for historians to actually really not just shift their scales and units of analysis to, think about deep time and the Anthropocene, but I think also to really, address, to use their scholarship to address climate change. But not everyone would agree with that. So that's my first comment. And the second is that, what David said and what you have said, John, confirms for me something. I'm barely a historian, but I'm certainly not an environmental historian. But I have been struck by what seemed to me an odd lack of interdisciplinarity in a lot of the historical literature about the sea and ocean. And those of you who really work on this can tell, but and I'm generalizing here, but the fact that there is this huge literature on the sea, body of work on the sea and theorizing it and rethinking it and empirical studies in literature and anthropology and history. But when I read historians who are working on these topics, and you're an exception, John, but I think often there's a kind of historical framework. And then with the discussion here of environmental history, what you were calling for, David, it strikes me, in anthropology, which would of course be, you would think, is the most human-centric discipline, anthropology, right? There's this huge discussion of multi-species ethnography. When we think about the approach of new materialisms that's percolating through a number of disciplines, so people like Kuhl and Frost, Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, where she's got trash has agency, for Jane Bennett, she's a political theorist. I say this because I was really struck. We had a very distinguished visitor, a wonderful seminar 2 weeks ago in history, Walter Johnson, and he has this whole approach to materialism in his new book about slavery. But in fact, he wasn't engaging any of this kind of new materialism literature in other disciplines. And someone asked him a question, and this isn't to criticize Walter Johnson, but I think that it's surprising to me that the disciplines aren't crossed more, because this is a very interdisciplinary conversation. But the historians may want to critique me on this. But it strikes me what you're saying about environmental history confirms for me that it's, why aren't people talking about multi-species historiography, right? That would be a language adopted from anthropology. But there's a lot that's going on in anthropology that would address, people studying the agency of mushrooms and salmon and, anyways, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on.
Part of the problem with this, or the challenge of it, is that you actually have to know something about science. And that's not something that historians don't go into history to be able to then sort of read deep science about fish and plants. And so you have to spend a lot of time retooling yourself to do this. And, most people who sort of move into environmental history don't have the skill set. So it's it's almost a half-life work again to sort of redo this. The other problem is the kind of evidence thing. It's easy to talk about who goes over the ocean, but there's no real record or census of what's under the ocean, unless you do what scientists do, which look at, let's say, fecal remains and different kinds of things. But so I think historians just have to think of, looking at non-traditional kinds of evidence in this. But you can't go to Paris or London and just sit in a record office and get the kind of information that John would want for his muddy shore, or what I would sort of think if you're trying to think of the biomass and take it seriously. There isn't a group of agents more provocative and active than the fish population, which vastly outnumbers the human population. But there's no way for us to sort of calculate that and sort of document that. So it's a problem for historians. Oh, I agree.
I think there's not enough of that.
Yeah.
No, he's outstanding. Stefan Hellreich. Yes. Please.
Yeah, I actually think that broaching the subject of the shore and ecotonality may help historians to recover histories that are otherwise lost. Right? Yeah. Just to give an example from my own research, I was surprised to find when Bonaparte took Egypt, that one of his major headaches was a group of essentially marsh dwellers up near Alexandria who had a large lake and who rode along its shores and who could defy the French military techniques.
Yeah.
And that ecosystem no longer exists.
Yeah.
So it dropped out of the historiography altogether, even though there are large numbers of letters and memos by the French military about this problem, and it shows up in the French memoirs and so forth. So unless unless you're sensitive to
exactly.
To the subject, you just don't see it necessarily in the archives, even when it is there. And I think precisely as you said, because the shore is living, these ecotonal situations are fluid. They can very easily drop out of our history, and it's one of the shocks of the past is to rediscover these communities.
Well, as you say, there are reasons why things drop out of history. It's not just that we have some kind of Alzheimer's, historical Alzheimer's. They drop out because either they've vanished, but they never really vanish, but they vanish in the strategies or the strategics of people like Napoleon. I guess what I would say generally, sort of closing here, is that I'm getting a little tired of the mantra of climate change, not because I don't think it's one of our most important issues, but because it invariably reduces us to the status of sort of passive responders. Not, well, it's so massive that it seems to do so. What I would point out, and I hope I pointed out in this paper, is that climate has been changing a lot, but it's the climate of, you might say, opinion. And until we get people to recognize how much their own views of these basic elements have changed over time, wake them up to how much they're missing right in front of them, our chances of fundamental transformation are pretty dim. So at Rutgers last Wednesday, I talked about this unnatural disaster and tried to convince people that the logic of Governor Christie and Barack Obama in bringing immediately nature into an antagonistic relationship by declaring, as Christie did, we are stronger than the storm, reproduces a kind of militarized antagonism between history and nature, humanity and nature, that is bound to fail. It's failing right now. It's failing right in front of us. So I want to get back to the point where we can understand our own responsibilities for the way the shore is today. Once we've taken up responsibility for the condition of the shores, for the condition of nature, then we'll be in a position to do something about it. But until we stop this kind of nature blaming operation, it's pretty sad. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, one more. Okay.
Is this thing on? Okay. So I just wanted to kind of quickly pronounce the incantatory name Prodel in this company, and talk about another connection, not an interdisciplinary connection in this case, but an interoceanic or interthalassological, if you will, I guess, connection. I mean, Juan has already taken us to the into political history and social history. Brodelian studies, of course, are grounded in environmental history, but it's not the kind of radical and profound kind of environmental history that we've been hearing about. That I think David did a really good job of setting that forward as a provocation, right? But Prodel, and especially the scholarship that has been done in the wake of Prodel in the Mediterranean, has done a really good job of putting all kinds of systemic interconnections, and of course Horton and Purcell have pushed that even a step further into looking at the human connectivity that links shore to shore and island to island, and creates sort of a web work that stretches right out, across the waters. And this, I think, is a really it's a can be a really fruitful, really productive model for thinking through oceanic connections on other bodies of water as well. I don't claim any kind of proficiency in this scholarship, but what it sounds to me is like some of these connections are not being sort of imported into other bodies of water, and these sorts of models are not necessarily being used for scholarship in other bodies of water. And I wonder if it might be possible to.
Well, Braudel did actually inspire all sorts of scholarship in the Indian Ocean, for example. So yeah, I couldn't have written this book without Braudel. And I fully acknowledge that. There are lots of other archaeologists, they haven't been given sufficient credit, who examined who are now examining the underwater nature of human civilization, and once we get that fully funded and examined, we'll know a lot more about shores, and we'll know a lot more about ourselves. My point here is that when I got into this, I'm an old-fashioned humanistic scholar. I really do believe that historians can provide a framework of understanding and perspective and meaning for people. And I discovered that the shore is, of course, full of meaning as well as creatures. And I really enjoyed the process of following those ideas as much as the people who inhabited those shores. So to me, anyway, and I think you can establish this now, the shore is now a primary place of meaning making in the Western world, at least, and to understand why it is that, and to then produce a critique of that, this kind of research is necessary. Anyway, I think I should stop.
Well, I think it's lunchtime. There was a question on the internet which is very personal, and you can answer it very quickly. Do you live in California and Maine? This person observes. Do you consider yourself a mainlander, an islander, or something completely different? Bi-coastal. Okay. Coast. I thought that was a word we weren't supposed to use.
Sign of shame. For the Republican Party, it's probably a tag you wouldn't want, but I consider myself a bi-coastal.
You live only in blue states, is that it?
No.
Okay, so this symposium will reconvene at 1:30 for the speakers and discussants. If you want to gather up here, so we can take you to lunch. The rest of you fend for yourselves. You're on your own.
But come back. Yes.
You're not invited. You know how it goes. So 1:30, we'll come back, and we have two great speakers then and discussants as well. Thank you.